Well, I feel really privileged and delighted to be here. And I think before I say anything else, I just want to offer heartfelt thanks to Owsley and Sarah and Owsley's mother and everyone at the Festival of Faiths, not just for the ecstatic music of last night, but for turning this into a city of conversation and a city of cross-cultural inquiry. It's remarkable for a visitor like me to set foot in a place whose mayor has said he wants his city to be a city of compassion. And clearly, one of the people who would most rejoice in that, of course, is our friend Thomas Merton, who 51 years ago said, "The great business of today is this, that a man find himself in another on the other side of the planet." And of course, it's remarkable to arrive in a city where you see quotes from Merton at the baggage carousel in the airport, and a plaque on 4th Avenue recording his famous revelation there. I've got to say at the outset, I'm an imposter. I wouldn't know nonviolence if it hit me in the face. And I'm really here under false pretenses. Most of you know that last year, the theme of this festival was Sacred Journeys and Thomas Merton, and both of those are very close to my heart. So the organizers kindly invited me, but I couldn't make it, so they generously invited me to come this year, even though no one has ever accused me of sacred wisdom. So I thought really the only way I could justify my presence here was by talking about one of Thomas Merton's dearest friends and spiritual brothers, and somebody I've been lucky enough to witness practicing nonviolence in the most rigorous and unillusioned way for 42 years now. And I was just remembering, as I was flying over here 3 days ago, one October morning, 27 years ago, when I was driving around California near my mother's house, and I suddenly heard on the radio that the Nobel Prize for Peace had been awarded to His Holiness the 14th Dalai Lama. And I happened to know he was in California just down the road at the time, and I'd been lucky enough to know His Holiness since I was 17. So what did I do on the busiest day of his life but barge in on him with some questions? And His Holiness, characteristically, was staying in a small family house in Newport Beach, and characteristically, too, was enjoying one of his favorite occupations, a conference with scientists. And, of course, the phone was ringing off the hook, telegrams were flooding in, but the minute he saw me at the front door, he grabbed my hand and whisked me off into a small room so we could speak, really for all the world as if I were his oldest friend on the planet. And as you all know, one of the Dalai Lama's greatest gifts is for treating even strangers as if they were his oldest friends on the planet, with the result that even strangers start to think of the Dalai Lama as their oldest friend on the planet. And as soon as we arrived at the little room, he started bustling around and he said, "Would you be more comfortable over here, or would this be comfortable and convenient for you, or would you rather be over here?" Really as if I were the newly crowned laureate and he the intrusive journalist. And so I saw that nonviolence is not just about advancing your own ideas and designs, but about listening and about attending to the preferences and needs of others. And as Thomas Merton's lifelong friend Robert Lax used to say, "Acquire the spirit of peace and 1,000 souls will be saved around you." And of course, on that day, everybody who cared about Tibet, and most Tibetans, were rejoicing. And they said, now that His Holiness has been acknowledged by the Nobel Committee, our problems are behind us. Not so the Dalai Lama, who, in my experience, is much more grounded than most of the people around him. And as we spoke, he said that he really wondered whether what he was doing was enough. But all he could do, he said, was try with every breath and every day, step by step, to walk in the direction of nonviolence in the conviction that ultimately enough people would join him on that march to effect a transformation of the world. And of course, those were very prescient words, because 27 years on, more people than ever care about Tibet, and Tibet is closer to destruction than ever before. And as we went on talking, the Dalai Lama suddenly looked over at me, and he said, "Well, I've won all this money. What should I do with it?" I was a clueless hack. I was barely out of my 20s. I didn't know what to do with my own pocket money. And I'm not Tibetan, I'm not Buddhist, I'm not a monk, but I could tell he was sincerely going to solicit advice from everybody he met those initial days. And in the event, he did give the money that he had been awarded not to the Tibetan community, but to Africa to help with the starving people there, and to India to help resolve the problems of leprosy, and to Costa Rica to set up a university for peace. And so I understood that nonviolence was in some ways about thinking in terms of the larger picture and the bigger we, as His Holiness always says. And as many of you know, there were many young, restless people in the Tibetan community who quite understandably say, let's lead a peace march on Beijing, or let's block a Chinese road, let's blow up a Chinese radio station. And His Holiness always looks at them and says, do you really think that such a gesture is going to turn around a proud, rather intractable government with many more pressing problems on its mind? And more than that, don't you think an act such as that will win the headlines of the globe for 3 days and squander Tibet's moral integrity and the reason that the world respects it forever? And that reminded me that nonviolence is really about thinking in the long term. And then our time was up, so he grabbed me by the hand and he took me to the front door, and then he suddenly said, "Oh, I've forgotten something," and led me back into the small room and turned off the light. And he said, it's such a simple thing. It has nothing to do with divinity or nirvana or enlightenment. It's just a practical thing. But if more and more people do that, more and more every day, this is what will save the planet. And of course, I realized he was talking about nonviolence too. But one thing I cherished was that it's such a universal ecumenical act. And I've got to confess to you, in the 27 years since, I've heard so many soaring ideas and beautiful pieces of philosophical wisdom, but almost none has stayed with me as much as that simple act that I can do 10 times every morning, and indeed try to do. And it was a tonic reminder that nonviolence is not just about words and ideas, but action. As I say, I was lucky enough first to meet the Dalai Lama at his home in Dharamsala in 1974, because, as you heard from Donovan, my father was a professional philosopher, and he was interested in many religions, Buddhism among them. And so as soon as the Dalai Lama came into exile in 1959, my father sailed all the way back from England, where we were living, to India, and enjoyed a long audience with him, and then I more or less inherited that connection. So I got to listen to the Dalai Lama on his first trip to this country in 1979. And then I started meeting him quite often in New York and California, and then we started doing events together all across the globe. And in 1985, as soon as Tibet opened up to the larger world, I went there. And some of you probably know that it's impossible not to be moved by the spirit of intensity and devotion that you see there, perhaps an even stronger spirit the more the culture is embattled. And more recently, for 8 straight Novembers, the Dalai Lama came to Japan, where I live, and so my wife and I were lucky enough to travel every hour of his working day for day after day after day, every year, by his side as part of his tiny entourage. So, of course, we got to have lunch with him every day. We got to attend all his public events. But he was also kind enough to let us sit in on every one of his private audiences with old friends and spiritual leaders and scientists, even heavy metal musicians who wanted to impart a Buddhist message. And I would, I would say that having spent all that time watching him day in, day out, if I were to summarize the Dalai Lama in one word, having seen him work as a monk, as a strategist, sometimes as a brother, sometimes as a friend, that word would be realist. As all of you know, he has been leading his people for 76 years now, through World War II and then the Cultural Revolution, the Information Revolution, so much more. And so he has no interest in wishy-washy ideas or notions that just sound good. And he stresses that nonviolence is not going to have any meaning, and all the peace treaties in the world are not going to have any effect until each one of us comes to a larger and more inclusive vision within. And I never forget, one day we were traveling in Japan on the bullet train, and I had just found a sentence from Mao Zedong in which Chairman Mao said, "I am the universe. Up is down, the yang is the yin, dirty is clean, big is small." In other words, the classic dictator statement that what I say goes and objective reality has no meaning. And I happened to mention this to the Dalai Lama, and he grabbed my arm, and he said, "Never, never say anything bad about Mao Zedong. You can criticize the action because the action is behind us. There's nothing we can do about it now. But never criticize the agent or the actor, because that person at any moment is capable of transformation." And of course, it was really, really humbling and worthy of a clap, and much more than that, to see to see this man jump to the defense of the person who had tried to destroy Tibet and who had made his own life so difficult. And it reminded me what we all know and what we've already heard, that nonviolence is a verb, and that pacifism is nothing like passivity. And the Dalai Lama always stresses that there will always be violence and conflict in the world. Humans are humans. But every single one of us, at every moment, has the capacity to look at that violence in a more peaceful way. We have more power than we know. And just like the Catholic Church, he always stresses that all our problems are interconnected. We can never have peace until we have justice. And we can't have justice so long as we have inequalities increasing across the globe. And those inequalities will keep increasing as long as we fail to tend to the environment. So nonviolence means going to that place in the mind and in the world where all those problems are interwoven and finding the cure to them at the source. Again, I remember one time we were near Hiroshima in Japan, and we were climbing up a hill to visit a temple that a Tibetan teacher had started there. And as the Dalai Lama was walking up the hill, suddenly a young woman strode forwards, and she said, "Lama, Dalai Lama, I need to talk to you." And of course, his bodyguards whisked her away. And we continued up the hill, and we sat quietly in the temple, and the Dalai Lama meditated for maybe 10 minutes. And as we were sitting there, I could hear her shouting outside. And I was really worried about what would happen when His Holiness stepped out. Well, to my surprise, when he did step out, he asked his bodyguards to bring the young woman to him. And he stood about a few inches away from her. He cupped her face in his hand. He looked deep into her eyes. He said a few words, and I think he more or less conveyed, "You have nothing to be afraid of from me. We're just the same humans, subject to the same frustrations and sufferings and aspirations. We have much more in common than apart." And I couldn't tell you if that did any good, but it surely did no harm. And of course, it instructed me and everybody around us. If somebody right now were to stand up and start heckling, my impulse would be to race off into the wings. But nothing would be achieved by that. The only way we can resolve any impasse is through dialogue. And I was just reading a beautiful book about the atomic bombing on Nagasaki, and one of the rare survivors of that event said, "The basis of peace is understanding the pain of others. And in the Tibetan context, of course, Tibet and China are always going to be neighbors, as we and Mexico are. So for Tibetans to attack the Chinese would be to make their neighbors their victims. And for the Chinese to keep oppressing Tibet is essentially for China to keep oppressing itself. When riots broke out in Lhasa, Tibet in 2008, you probably remember the Dalai Lama began every day by praying for his Chinese brothers and sisters, because of course they were victims of the unrest as well as the Tibetans. And whenever I see somebody ask him what he or she can do for Tibet, he always says one thing: don't listen to Tibetan propaganda. Don't listen to Chinese propaganda. Please just go to Tibet and bring back an objective, unbiased account of what you see and hear there. Because much like his big boss, as he calls him, the Buddha, the Dalai Lama is really a doctor. He's a doctor of the mind. And no doctor can really attend to a patient if he can't meet that patient and if he doesn't know where the suffering is coming from. And for me, as a non-Buddhist, one of the things that makes the Dalai Lama's vision of nonviolence so persuasive is, first, that he enacts it in the political realm, secondly, that he's a scientist, but thirdly, that he is a student of history. And of course, for 70 years at least, he has had a front-seat view on all the developments across the world. He has seen his great friend Václav Havel in prison, and 8 weeks later, Mr. Havel was unanimously chosen president of the Czech Republic. He has seen his great supporter and friend and comrade in arms, Desmond Tutu, unable to vote for 62 years in the country of his birth, South Africa, because of apartheid. And then suddenly apartheid is gone, Nelson Mandela is president, and Archbishop Tutu can help lead his country into a new era. And as we all know, many, many problems still exist in South Africa, but officially sanctioned racism is not one of them. And in the Tibetan context, again, the Dalai Lama knows that there have been times in history when Tibet has all but overrun the whole of China. There have been other times, as now, when China has all but obliterated Tibet. But things are changing constantly, moment by moment, and the only thing that we can do is be ready to work with each new reality. It was Václav Havel who gave us that ringing line that hope is not the certainty that everything will turn out right, because so often it doesn't. It is just the conviction that there is a meaning to things, that there is a logic and an order behind events, even if it's not one that we can apprehend. And of course, it was Archbishop Tutu who gave us that beautiful sentence at the beginning of one of his recent books: "I'm not an optimist. I'm not an idealist. I'm a realist." So, to conclude, I think the Dalai Lama's notion of nonviolence really arises from two core principles that are dear to him. The first is that you change the world by changing the way you look at the world. We have the capacity to transform our vision at every moment. And the second is that suffering is not the same as unhappiness. From his point of view, suffering is the nature of human existence. Everyone in this room, if we are lucky, will see old age. Almost everybody in this room will know disease. Certainly, everybody in this room will know death. But unhappiness is just the position we choose, or if we want, cannot choose, to bring to all of those. And I sometimes think that in the course of my life, the person I've met who has probably seen the most suffering is the Dalai Lama. He has had to live outside his homeland for 57 years now. He is carrying on his human shoulders the hopes and the aspirations of 14 million Tibetan Buddhists, and he is every day blocked and mocked by the largest nation on earth. And yet, what is he famous for? As you all saw when he was at this very festival, his infectious laugh, his broad smile, and his robust confidence. So finally, I think what he's telling us is that to be a realist is to be a believer in possibility. Thank you.